question for all of you. How many of you, somewhere in your past, have done something for which you needed forgiveness? Now, don't have to raise your hand, but you can if you want to. Now, okay, so how many of you know people that need your forgiveness and you are very happy to oblige them? And why are that? But also I'm going to answer this question, how many people do you know that need your forgiveness that you really don't feel like forgiving in the present moment? Can you think of anybody that you're just kind of struggling with and thinking, well, I could forgive them if, and you kind of got a list of ifs, if they would apologize, if they would come crawling, if they would repay me, if they would do this, if they would do that, then it would be a lot easier. But for the time being, I'm having some struggles with this. Well, I want to talk about today what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, one single verse here. It goes beyond one single verse, but it is one single verse here in verse 32 of Ephesians chapter 4. And I'm going to talk, I've entitled this Forgiving Freedom. What the Apostle Paul says to the church, be kind and compassionate one to another, forgiving each other just as Christ has forgave you. It is in this context that we recognize there are several things that the Apostle Paul is asking the membership to do. First of all, to be kind. Secondly, to be compassionate. Thirdly, to forgive one another. Fourthly, as Christ has forgiven us. So it is imperative for us to understand and to have an appreciation for how and when Christ has forgiven each one of us. Because I think it can be said that not every one of us forgives in the same way. We oftentimes say, well, I forgive, but I can't forget. And I'm not going to forget, and by the way, I don't want to forget. There are others who say, I forgive, and I would really like to forget this. I'd like to be able to move on. Another problem is, in terms of forgiving, is this: not everyone accepts forgiveness. That is a difficulty. You may not think it should be a difficulty, but there are people, for example, who will pay their own way, so to speak. No, I won't allow you to kind of pay my debt, as it were. I can do this on my own, and I will not accept it. Or the fact that you just simply, it is not possible for you to feel that you could be forgiven, and because you may have a long track history of things that you've done and you feel like it is impossible. I had an interesting conversation with an individual not long ago when we were talking about Jesus and we were talking about having a life, and interestingly enough, the person said, I was talking about Jesus, and said, well, he is who I'd like to be like, but I can't. I've made too many messes in my life. And it really caused me to think about this factor. How many of us in our lifetime have had people who wanted to come over to our homes, and we would not allow them to come over or to come in until we got our mess cleaned up? As a pastor who visited people, and unfortunately not always in the most appropriate way, in the sense that we used to kind of show up and knock on people's door, not giving a whole lot of warning that we were coming, which is always scary in itself back in the past. And for that I ask forgiveness if that ever happened to you, and probably did happen to you. But people were embarrassed by the situation they might be in. And one of the funniest ones is I walked up this person's door, and I was about to knock, and the lady was busy cussing out her husband, big time, and the like. I mean, yelling big time, and I knocked, and of course they let me in, and I thought, oh wow, what a change, and because it was a surprise in that regard. And then another aspect is not everyone is willing to forgive. And human forgiveness, though, I think that we need to understand what we're talking about today. We're talking about several things which are applicable to us. We may talk about human forgiveness in the sense of that not everything that we forgive is sin. We make mistakes. We may leave something out. We may say the wrong thing. We're not trying to be, hurtful or anything, but for which we need forgiveness. And, of course, there's always those things that we need forgiveness that in the moment we do not recognize that we need to be forgiven of that and want God to forgive us. We want the individual to forgive us as well. But we're talking about, in the term of human forgiveness, there's that. But we're also talking about in the forgiveness that comes from sin and how that works in our life. So human forgiveness, again, is part of what Paul is describing here, because about the human compassion, about the wrongs that we do to one another. So Paul describes a forgiveness, though, that comes through Christ. And it talks about this with the brethren there. And I'm going to suggest to us that the forgiveness in Jesus truly is a freeing forgiveness. And there is a difference between that humanly and what we need to understand and appreciate. Because Jesus sets us free to forgive. Now, if we are really black and white, if we're concrete individuals, if we are literalists, if we are self-righteous, if we are ultimate keepers of the law, we will find that there are things that we will struggle with in terms of forgiveness. So let me give an example of that. Old Testament, for example, there were laws set in place that if a person did this or that, you had a responsibility and an action that had to be taken. You might put them outside the camp. Certain cases, if they did certain things, you were required to stone them. They were not allowed to live. And you were part of that. By the way, no matter if they repented, that it was over and done with. The law required. And that's what Paul says and reminds us of, that is different in the ministry of reconciliation. The law, the letter of the law kills. The spirit of the law gives life. And so we have to be aware of that. It is in Jesus that we find that we are given permission in a way that they did not have in times past to forgive. And in areas that they would not have been forgiven in the same way as we find here. So the new covenant establishes grace, and His grace sets us free to do well for other individuals and to forgive. Now, here are some of the questions that concern us in terms of forgiveness. And I've written these down in your notes. And one is, what is the limit on our forgiveness? Are there sins too big and too bad to forgive? Now, I'm going to suggest that all of us have encountered some sins in our lives where we ourselves or others, we feel that those sins are too big and too bad to be forgiven. And they're certainly too big and too bad to be forgiven in the moment. And possibly we'll get over it over a period of time. So it's a question about, is there a limit on the forgiveness? And then what about the sins of others? Now, it is, how do we deal with other people's sins? Both those sins that they know about, and what about the sins of others that they do not know about? And I would suggest that all of us have sins of others that other people do not know about. And we have sins ourselves that others don't know about. Things that we've not told them, nor in this lifetime do we intend to tell them. And we kind of measure those things out. Then the question is, when will we be forgiven?
Feeling the blues today, or tired of life already? Do you have questions about life, or need spiritual advice? The Worldwide Church of God is located in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto, California. We welcome everyone to attend our worship services with us every week at the times listed on your screen.